Look, I've seen some messed up stuff in my time. 3 tours in Iraq will do that to you. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I experienced working nights at Riverside Memorial Cemetery. After I got back stateside in 2019, I couldn't sleep worth a damn. The VA docs called it adjustment disorder, gave me some pills that made me feel like a zombie. My buddy Rico suggested I find work that matched my screwed up sleep schedule, so I took a job as night security at the cemetery. Figured dead people would be quieter than my neighbors, you know? The pay was decent. And honestly, after dealing with IEDs and mortar fire, walking around headstones seemed pretty peaceful. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., mostly just checking locks, making sure no kids were vandalizing anything, keeping an eye out for copper thieves who liked to steal the plaques. Everything was normal for the first couple months. I'd make my rounds, listen to podcasts, drink too much coffee. The place was old, some graves dating back to the 1800s, but well-maintained. During the day's shift, you'd see families bringing flowers, veterans placing flags, the usual stuff. But there was this one grave that caught my attention. Section C, row 15. The headstone was weathered granite. Simple military marker. Kozlov, Victor S., Sergeant U.S. Army, Vietnam 1947 to 1998. No flowers, ever. No visitors that I could see. The grass around it was a little overgrown compared to the others. Here's where it gets weird. About 3 months into the job, I started noticing fresh red poppies on Victor's grave during my Thursday night rounds. Just 3 of them, placed carefully at the base of the headstone. I figured maybe the groundskeepers were doing some kind of memorial thing, but when I asked my supervisor, he had no clue what I was talking about. The poppies kept appearing every Thursday. Always fresh, always the same number, always red. I started timing my rounds differently, trying to catch whoever was leaving them. But here's the thing. I'd check the grave at midnight. Nothing there. Come back at 2 a.m. and boom, there they'd be. One night in October, I decided to stake it out. I positioned myself behind this big marble angel about 50 feet away. Had a clear view of Victor's grave. Around 1:30 a.m., I saw him. A figure in military fatigues was kneeling at the headstone. At first, I thought it was just another veteran paying respects, but something fell off. The guy was completely motionless, like he was carved from stone. No breathing, no shifting around like people normally do when they kneel for that long. I called out, "Hey, cemetery's closed." But the figure didn't respond, didn't even turn around. I started walking toward him, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. That's when I got my first real look at the guy. His uniform was old, Vietnam era by the look of it. But here's what made my blood freeze. I could see right through him, like he was made of smoke and moonlight. When I was about 10 feet away, he stood up slowly and turned to face me. His face was young, maybe mid-20s, with eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. He looked me dead in the face and gave me a perfect military salute. Then he mouthed something I couldn't hear and just dissolved, like morning mist. I stood there for I don't know how long, heart pounding like I was back in a firefight. The 3 red poppies were there at the base of the headstone, fresh as if they'd just been picked. I couldn't shake what I'd seen. Started doing research on Victor Kozlov during my days off. Turned out he'd served 2 tours in Vietnam. Came back with what they used to call battle fatigue. Never married, no kids that anyone knew about. Died alone in a VA hospital. No family claimed the body, so he got a military burial here at Riverside. But here's the kicker, and this is where my world turned upside down. I found his service record online. Victor Kozlov wasn't just any random veteran. According to the documents, he was my father. My mom always told me my dad died when I was a baby, some kind of accident. She remarried when I was 5, and my stepdad adopted me, gave me his name. I never thought to question it. But seeing that service record, seeing the dates, everything clicked into place. I confronted my mom about it over Thanksgiving dinner. She broke down crying, told me the truth. Victor had severe PTSD, couldn't hold down a job, turned to drinking. She was young, scared, didn't know how to help him. So she left, took me with her, and never looked back. She thought it was better if I never knew. The Thursday visits continued, but now I understood. Every week, I'd see him there, this ghostly figure keeping watch over his own grave. Sometimes he'd look at me and nod like he was acknowledging me. I started leaving my own flowers there too, not poppies, but small American flags on holidays. The last time I saw him was on Veterans Day. Instead of kneeling, he was standing at attention next to his headstone. When he saw me approaching, he saluted again, but this time he smiled, actually smiled. Then he faded away, and I never saw him after that. I left the security job a few months later, got into counseling, started dealing with my own demons. But I still visit Victor's grave every Thursday, still leave those red poppies. Because I finally understand, he wasn't haunting that cemetery. He was waiting for his son to find him, to know his story, to remember him. Some people say the dead can't rest until they've made peace with the living. I think Victor finally found his peace. And in a weird way, so did I. Story 2. I'm not one to believe in ghost stories, all right? 3 deployments to Afghanistan, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Bronze Star. I've seen enough real horror to last 10 lifetimes. But what happened to me at Arlington National Cemetery still gives me chills. And I'm not ashamed to admit it. This was back in 2021, about 6 months after I got out. I was struggling, if I'm being honest. Couldn't find work that felt meaningful after leading Marines in combat. Everything seemed trivial compared to what we'd been through over there. My therapist suggested I visit Arlington, said it might help with what she called survivor's guilt. I picked a Tuesday in March because I figured it'd be less crowded. Took the metro down from Baltimore, where I was crashing at my sister's place. The cemetery was exactly what you'd expect. Pristine, solemn, rows and rows of white headstones stretching out like a marble sea. I made my way to Section 60, where they bury the Iraq and Afghanistan casualties. That's where my guys were. Staff Sergeant Martinez, Corporal Johnson, Lance Corporal Chun. 3 Marines from my squad who didn't make it home. Martinez stepped on an IED outside Marja. Johnson caught a sniper's bullet during a patrol in Helmand. Chun died in my arms after a convoy got hit by an RPG. I found their graves and just sat there for a while, telling them about stupid stuff, how the Phillies were doing, how my niece was learning to walk, how I couldn't figure out what the hell to do with my life now that I was back. You know, the kind of one-sided conversations you have with people who can't answer back. The sun was starting to set when I decided to head out. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of combat boots on pavement. Not the casual walking of visitors, but the sharp, rhythmic cadence of Marines on patrol. Left, right, left, right. Perfect synchronization. I turned around, expecting to see an honor guard or maybe some active duty Marines paying their respects. But the pathway behind me was empty. The sound kept coming though, getting closer. My training kicked in automatically. I found myself scanning for threats, looking for cover, even though logically I knew I was in one of the safest places in America. Then I saw them. They were translucent, like looking through fog, but unmistakably Marines. Full combat gear, rifles at the ready, moving in a tactical formation down the pathway between the graves. There were maybe 8 or 10 of them, and they moved with the fluid precision that only comes from months of operating together in hostile territory. My first instinct was to think I was having some kind of breakdown. PTSD-induced hallucination, maybe, but I could see details that were too specific, too real. The way the point man held his M4, the hand signals they used, the subtle movements that showed they were clearing each row of headstones as they advanced. As they got closer, I started recognizing faces. Martinez was there, looking exactly like he did the day he died. Young, serious, that little scar on his chin from when he wiped out on his motorcycle in 29 Palms. Johnson was running slack, covering the right flank just like he always did. And there, in the middle of the formation, was Chun. My heart just about stopped. Chun looked different from the others, more solid, more present. When the patrol reached my position, he held up his fist, and the whole squad froze in place. Military precision, even in death. He turned to look at me, and I swear I could see right into his eyes. They were the same dark brown eyes that looked up at me in that destroyed Humvee, the same eyes that had tried to stay focused as the life drained out of him. Chin stepped out of formation and walked over to where I was standing. He moved his lips, but no sound came out at first. Then, like someone slowly turning up the volume on a radio, I heard his voice, quiet but clear as day. "Tell my wife I'm still watching over her." That was it, just those 7 words. Then he stepped back into formation, gave some kind of hand signal, and the entire patrol continued their march down the pathway. I watched them move between the headstones until they just faded away, like they'd walked into invisible mist. I stood there shaking for about 10 minutes, trying to process what I'd just experienced. Part of me wanted to rationalize away, blame it on stress or medication or whatever, but Chen's message felt too important, too specific to ignore. See, Chen had gotten married just 2 months before our deployment. His wife, Sarah, was pregnant when he left, and she gave birth to their daughter while we were downrange. He never got to meet his little girl. I'd been to the funeral, seen how destroyed Sarah was, but I hadn't kept in touch after that. Honestly, it was too painful. But Chen's message wouldn't leave me alone. 3 days later, I tracked down Sarah's contact information through mutual friends. Turns out she was living in San Diego with their daughter, Emma, who was now 3 years old. I called her, which was awkward as hell. How do you tell someone you saw their dead husband's ghost? But I found a way to work into the conversation, said I had been thinking about Chun and wondered how she was doing. That's when Sarah told me something that made my blood run cold. For the past 2 years, Emma had been talking about the soldier man who stood in her bedroom doorway at night. Sarah had assumed it was just a kid's imagination, maybe influenced by all the military photos around the house. But Emma's descriptions were incredibly detailed. She'd talk about his uniform, his serious expression, the way he would nod at her before disappearing. She says he's watching to make sure the monsters don't come, Sarah told me, her voice breaking. I never told her about how her father died protecting people. How could she know that? I told Sarah about my experience at Arlington, about Chen's message. She cried, and I cried, and we talked for 2 hours about the Marine we both missed. Since then, we've kept in touch. Sarah says Emma still sees her father sometimes, but now she understands who he is. I go back to Section 60 every few months. Haven't seen the Phantom Patrol again, but I always listen for those footsteps, because I know now that some bonds, the ones forged in combat, in brotherhood, in love, don't break just because someone dies. They find a way to endure, to protect, to comfort. Marines never leave their own behind, not even in death. Story 3. You want to know about something that'll mess with your head? Try hearing dead soldiers tapping out messages from 6 feet under. Yeah, I know how that sounds, but I swear on my mother's grave, which, ironically, is in the same cemetery where this all went down, every word I'm about to tell you is true. This happened when I got back from the Gulf in '92. The Navy had me stationed at Norfolk, but I was going through a divorce and needed extra cash. So I picked up weekend work doing maintenance at Hillcrest Memorial Cemetery back in my hometown of Richmond. Small place, maybe 300 graves, half of them dating back to the Civil War. The work was simple enough: mowing grass, trimming hedges, replacing burnout bulbs on the pathway lights. Peaceful, you know? After months of being cooped up on a destroyer in the Persian Gulf, working outdoors with my hands felt therapeutic. The cemetery was laid out in sections. The newer graves were up front near the road. Then you had the 1900s folks in the middle, and way in the back was the old section. Civil War era, mostly. Those headstones were something else. All weathered granite and marble angels worn smooth by a century of rain. I'd been working there about 2 months when I first heard the tapping. It was a Saturday evening in October, just after sunset. I was replacing some pathway bulbs near the Civil War section when I heard this rhythmic tapping sound coming from underground. Tap, 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 pause, tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. At first, I figured it was pipes settling or maybe some kind of irrigation system acting up. But the sound was too regular, too deliberate. Being Navy, I'd learned Morse code in training, and something about the pattern seemed familiar. I stopped what I was doing and listened closer. The tapping was definitely coming from beneath the ground, somewhere near a cluster of Civil War graves. All Union soldiers, according to the headstones, 22nd Virginia Infantry, which are confusing because Virginia was Confederate, but I learned later that some Virginia units stayed loyal to the Union. The tapping continued for about 5 minutes, then stopped abruptly. I marked the general area and went back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just heard something important. Next Saturday, same time, same place, the tapping started again. This time I was ready. I grabbed a notepad from my truck and started writing down the pattern. Tap, 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 pause, tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. Long, short, long, short, long, short, long. It took me a while, but I finally decoded it. The message was coordinates. 37 degrees, 32 minutes, 14 seconds north, 77 degrees, 26 minutes, 8 seconds west. Now, I'm not superstitious by nature. 20 years in the Navy teaches you to deal with facts, not fairy tales. But those coordinates were too specific to ignore. I spent the next week researching Civil War battles in Virginia, trying to figure out what might be at that location. Turns out those coordinates pointed to a spot about 15 miles south of Richmond, near a place called Drury's Bluff. There had been a battle there in May 1864, part of the Bermuda Hundred Campaign. Union forces had taken heavy casualties, and according to the historical records, several soldiers from the 22nd Virginia Infantry had gone missing during the retreat. The tapping continued every Saturday at exactly 7:47 p.m. Always the same coordinates. Always the same desperate rhythm. I started bringing better equipment. A digital recorder, a compass, even a metal detector I borrowed from my neighbor. One evening, I decided to follow the coordinates. Drove out to the location, which was now just farmland owned by some guy named Patterson. The farmer was decent enough. Let me poke around his property when I explained what I was looking for. I spent hours walking that field with the metal detector. Found some old buttons, a few musket balls, the usual Civil War battlefield debris. But then, right at the exact coordinates from the tapping, the detector went crazy. I started digging. 3 feet down, I hit something solid. Not metal, bone, human bone. I stopped digging and called the State Archaeological Department. Took them 2 weeks to get out there, but when they did, they found the remains of 7 Union soldiers buried in a shallow mass grave. Based on the uniform fragments and personal effects, they were identified as members of the 22nd Virginia Infantry, reported missing after the Battle of Drury's Bluff. The crazy part? The names on the dog tags matched 7 of the headstones in the Civil War section of Hillcrest Cemetery. These guys have been buried as unknown back in 1864, but their bodies had never been recovered from the battlefield. I was there when they exhumed the remains. Professional job, very respectful. The archaeologist, Dr. Martinez, told me it was unusual to find such well-preserved remains, especially with clear evidence of the soldiers' final moments. They'd apparently taken cover in a small depression when they were overwhelmed by Confederate forces. Here's the part that still gives me goosebumps. Among the personal effects, they found a small piece of paper in what used to be a soldier's breast pocket. The paper was mostly illegible, but you could make out part of a message. Tell Martha, coordinates bring us home. The Army gave those 7 soldiers a proper military burial at Arlington National Cemetery. Full honors, honor guard, the works. I attended the ceremony, along with about 30 descendants of the soldiers' families who've been located through genealogy research. The Saturday after the reburial, I went back to Hillcrest for my regular maintenance work. Sunset came and went. 7:47 p.m. passed without a sound. No tapping, no Morse code, no desperate messages from beneath the ground. I kept working at that cemetery for another 3 years before I moved to Norfolk permanently. Never heard the tapping again. But sometimes on quiet Saturday evenings, I'd stand near those Civil War graves and listen, just in case. Because here's what I learned from that experience. Some soldiers will never stop fighting to get home. They'll tap out messages from beyond the grave, send coordinates across decades, wait patiently for someone who understands their code. Those 7 men from the 22nd Virginia Infantry had been trying to complete their final mission for 128 years. All they needed was someone willing to listen, to decode their message. to bring them home. In the Navy, we have a saying, "Don't give up the ship." Those soldiers never gave up. They kept tapping, kept calling out their coordinates, kept faith that someday someone would hear them and understand. I was just lucky enough to be the guy who spoke their language. Story 4. My grandfather was 93 years old and sharp as a tack until the day he died. Fought in World War II as a ball turret gunner on AB-17 Flying Fortress. Flew 35 missions over Nazi Germany when the average life expectancy for his job was about 15 missions. So when Grandpa Joe started talking to empty air at the Veterans Memorial Cemetery, I knew something was up. This was 3 years ago, Memorial Day 2022. I'd driven down from Lackland Air Force Base to take Grandpa to the ceremony honoring his old squadron. The 390th Bomb Group had a small memorial there, just a granite marker with the names of the crews who didn't make it home. Out of the 200 men who served in the squadron, only 12 were still alive, and Grandpa was one of the last 3. The ceremony was typical military. Honor guard, 21-gun salute, some speeches by local politicians who probably never served a day in their lives. Grandpa sat in his wheelchair, wearing his old service dress uniform that was now too big for his shrinking frame, his chest covered with ribbons most people wouldn't recognize. That's when it started getting weird. About halfway through the ceremony, Grandpa began nodding at empty spaces around us. Not the confused nodding of someone with dementia. I'd seen enough of that working at the VA hospital. This was different. He was acknowledging people, like he was seeing old friends in a crowd. Then he started talking. "Well, I'll be damned if it isn't Tommy Kowalski," he said to the spot about 3 feet to his left. "Still got that stupid grin, you son of a bitch." I looked where he was looking. Nothing there but empty air and grass. "Grandpa," I whispered, "who are you talking to?" He turned to me with the most lucid expression I'd seen from him in months. "The boys from the 570th Squadron," he said matter-of-factly. "They're all here. Tommy, Red Peterson, Lieutenant Morrison, the whole damn crew." I played along, figured it was just his mind playing tricks. But then he started reciting details that made my skin crawl. "Remember that mission to Schweinfurt, Tommy? October 14th, 43. Black Thursday, they called it. You were flying tailgun in Memphis Belle 2 when that Messerschmitt came up from your blind spot." Grandpa's voice took on the crisp cadence of a mission briefing. "Took out your oxygen line at 25,000 feet. You were unconscious when the plane went down over the Rhineland." Here's the thing. I'd never heard that story before. Grandpa rarely talked about the war. Said it was too painful. But he was rattling off details like he was reading from a mission report. Aircraft numbers, crew positions, exact dates. Even weather conditions. The ceremony continued. But Grandpa kept up his conversation with invisible companions. He'd point to different spots around us, calling out names, sharing memories. Other veterans' families started noticing. Some looked concerned. Others nodded knowingly like they'd seen this before. During the moment of silence, something incredible happened. The chaplain asked everyone to bow their heads in remembrance of the fallen. As the cemetery went quiet, I heard Grandpa whisper names under his breath. Dozens of them. Not random names, but specific call-outs like he was taking attendance. Anderson Charles. Present. Came a voice that wasn't his. I looked up sharply. Grandpa was still whispering names, but I swear I heard other voices responding. Faint, like an echo from a great distance, but definitely there. Baker William. Present. Chun David. Present. The responses kept coming one after another, in voices that sounded young and strong despite coming from men who'd been dead for 80 years. I looked around to see if anyone else was hearing this, but the other families seemed lost in their own moments of remembrance. After the ceremony, I helped Grandpa back to the car. He was quiet during the drive home, staring out the window with a peaceful expression I hadn't seen in years. "Grandpa," I finally asked, "what happened back there? Who were you really talking to?" He turned to me with tears in his eyes. "They were my boys, Rhiannon, my whole squadron. I've been seeing them more and more lately, especially when I'm in places like that cemetery. They look exactly like they did in 1943, young, brave, ready for anything. But Grandpa, those men died decades ago. I know that, he said firmly. But death doesn't break the bond you forge in combat. We were brothers, closer than family. We promised each other we'd never forget, never leave anyone behind. Over the next few months, I started talking to other military families. Turns out Grandpa's experience wasn't unique. The daughter of a Korean War veteran told me her father had similar conversations during visits to military cemeteries. A Vietnam vet's wife said her husband often talked to fallen comrades during quiet moments at memorials. The pattern was always the same: elderly veterans, usually in the final years of their lives, suddenly able to see and speak with their deceased brothers in arms. The conversations were detailed, specific, full of memories and inside jokes that the families had never heard before. Dr. Martinez at the VA called it end-of-life phenomena, said it was common for people approaching death to have vivid hallucinations about deceased loved ones. But the details were too accurate, too specific. These men were remembering things they'd never talked about, sharing stories that could be verified through military records. Grandpa passed away 6 months later, peacefully in his sleep. At his funeral, I met some relatives I'd never seen before, distant cousins who'd driven in from out of state. One of them, Uncle Pete, pulled me aside after the service. "Your grandfather ever tell you about his war buddies visiting him?" he asked. I nodded, wondering where this was going. Same thing happened to my dad, Joe's older brother who served in the Pacific. Near the end, he'd sit on his porch talking to Marines who died on Iwo Jima. He'd tell us their stories, describe their faces, even sing songs they used to sing in their foxholes. Uncle Pete smiled sadly. "I think when these old soldiers get close to crossing over, the barrier gets thin. Their fallen brothers come to escort them home, to welcome them into whatever comes next." I like to think he's right, that somewhere beyond this world, there's an eternal formation where warriors from every conflict stand together, where bonds forged in battle last forever. Because if there's one thing I learned from 20 years in the Air Force, it's that military brotherhood doesn't end with discharge papers. It doesn't end with retirement ceremonies. And apparently, it doesn't even end with death. Story 5. I've done a lot of Memorial Day ceremonies in my 22 years with the Army National Guard. Iraq, Afghanistan, stateside duty. Seen my share of military funerals and remembrance services. But what happened at Eternal Rest Veteran Cemetery in 2023 changed everything I thought I knew about honor, duty, and what it means to serve. Let me set the scene for you. Eternal Rest is one of those old military cemeteries that's been around since just after the Civil War. Sprawling place with sections for every American conflict you can think of. Revolutionary War patriots up on the hill. Civil War soldiers in neat rows. World War veterans stretching out toward the newer sections where we bury Iraq and Afghanistan casualties. I was there as part of the Honor Guard. 7 of us from the 116th Infantry Brigade. My job was rifle detail for the 21-gun salute. Standard ceremony. Speeches, wreath laying, moment of silence. Then we fire 3 volleys to honor the fallen. I'd done it probably 50 times before. The crowd was decent size for a Monday morning. Maybe 300 people scattered among the graves. Families with flags and flowers, veterans in their old uniforms, Boy Scout troops helping place markers. Normal Memorial Day stuff. Colonel Reynolds was giving the main address, talking about sacrifice and remembrance, when I first noticed something off. During rifle inspection, I counted our formation twice, because something didn't look right. We had 7 guardsmen, but when I glanced down the line, I could swear I saw more figures standing at attention. I shook it off. Long weekend, not enough sleep, probably just seeing things. The colonel finished his speech, and we moved into position for the gun salute. That's when things got really weird. As we raised our rifles to the first volley, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. More figures were forming up alongside us. Ghostly, translucent, but unmistakably military. Bang! First volley echoed across the cemetery. But here's the thing. I heard more shots than we fired. Way more. Like an entire company had opened up instead of just our 7-man detail. I glanced left and right. My guys were reloading for the second volley, but I could see muzzle flashes in empty air. Spirits in uniforms from every era you could imagine were firing rifles that flickered like candlelight. Second volley, bang. Again, the sound was massive. Dozens of phantom rifles firing in perfect synchronization with ours. The crowd didn't seem to notice anything unusual, but I was starting to sweat despite the cool morning air. Third volley, bang. This time I was ready for it. I counted the muzzle flashes. Had to be at least 50 ghostly soldiers firing alongside us. Revolutionary War uniforms, Civil War blue and gray. World War I doughboys, World War II GIs, Vietnam-era jungle fatigues, desert camis from Iraq and Afghanistan. A complete timeline of American military service, standing in formation, honoring their brothers. After the gun salute came the moment of silence. 2 minutes to remember the fallen. The colonel asked everyone to bow their heads, and the cemetery went quiet except for the distant sound of traffic and birds. That's when I heard the roll call. It started as a whisper, but grew stronger. A voice I didn't recognize, old, authoritative, with the cadence of a career and so, began calling names. Adams, Jonathan, Continental Army. Present. The response came from somewhere behind me, young and strong. Baker, Samuel, 2nd Massachusetts Infantry. Present. Chun David, 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Present. The names kept coming. Hundreds of them. Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Mexican-American War, Civil War from both sides, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Every conflict, every branch, every era, and after each name, that same response. Present. I opened my eyes and looked around. The living crowd still had their heads bowed in respectful silence, but I could see the dead standing among them. Rows and rows of transparent figures in military dress, standing at attention as their names were called. Some I recognized from monuments and memorials. The face of the unknown soldier, famous generals from history books. Others were clearly enlisted men, young faces that never got the chance to grow old. They stood together without regard for rank or era, united by their service and sacrifice. The roll call continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only those 2 minutes of silence. Names I'd never heard alongside names from medal honor citations. The famous and forgotten, all answering present when called. Then came the final name on the list. All who gave their lives in service to the United States of America. The response was thunderous. Every ghostly figure in that cemetery, and I could now see there were thousands of them, responded in unison. Present. The sound echoed across the hills like a battle cry, like the roar of warriors accepting their eternal posting. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing I'd ever heard. As the moment of silence ended and people began to raise their heads, a voice spoke directly into my ear, soft but clear as day. Thank you for remembering us, soldier. I turned to see who had spoken, but there was only empty air. The phantom formation was dissolving like morning mist, fading back to whatever realm they inhabited between our world and the next. The ceremony concluded normally after that. People dispersed to visit individual graves, left their flowers and flags, shared their memories. I helped pack up the equipment, but my hands were shaking the entire time. That evening, I called my grandfather, 96 years old, Normandy veteran, told him what I'd experienced, half expecting him to think I'd lost my mind. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Cassius, every Memorial Day I dream about my old unit. We're all there together, the guys who made it home and the ones who didn't, standing together like we used to, like brothers. You think it really happened, Grandpa? Son, he said, death is just another posting. Those boys are still serving, still standing guard. And every Memorial Day, they report for duty to make sure we remember why they fell. I've done 3 more Memorial Day ceremonies since then. Haven't seen the phantom formation again, but I listen for it. Listen for that roll call, for the sound of warriors answering present across the centuries. Because I understand now what Memorial Day really is. It's not just about remembrance. It's about accountability. It's the one day each year when the living report to the dead, when we stand before those who gave everything and account for what we've done with the freedom they bought us. And somewhere in the space between worlds, they're still keeping watch, still standing guard, still ready to answer when their names are called.